From religion to wrestling, gumbo to grits, politics to poetry, and all things Southern in between, this is Take on the South. Produced by the Institute for Southern Studies and hosted by the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of South Carolina, Take on the South examines the highs and lows of the American South, examines the truths and fictions of the country's most distinctive region, and picks the brains of some of its most accomplished students. To understand the South, you need to take it on, and that's what we'll be doing. Join us as we take on the South. Planes, trains, automobiles. They are, of course, part and parcel of the American highly cherished ideal of freedom, tethered closely as they are to the notion of movement, the liberty to place bodies in place and time, to hit the open road. But that is a conceit and a story only very partially told, for this American road wasn't always open. Travel in U.S. history was much more contingent, restricted, and unequal. It had, and still has, everything to do with race. To help us make sense of the largely untold history of race and transportation, we are honored to welcome to the show Professor Mia Bay. The Roy F. and Jeanette P. Nichols Professor of American History at the University of Pennsylvania, Mia Bay is one of this country's most respected scholars of the history of race and civil rights. A graduate of the University of Toronto and Yale University, Professor Bay is a prolific author and has published some absolutely seminal books in her field, including but not limited to The White Image in the Black Mind, African American Ideas About White People, which was published in 2000, and To Tell the Truth Freely, The Life of Ida B. Wells, which was published in 2009. Her most recent book, and the subject of our conversation today, is Traveling Black, A Story of Race and Resistance, winner of a clutch of top awards, including the prestigious 2022 Bancroft Prize in American History. The book was published by Harvard in 2021. Mia Bay, welcome to Take on the South.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Before we get into the details of what is a really quite remarkable book, in my opinion, can we step back just a bit to give listeners a sense of your work generally? What do you consider your field? How would you characterize what you do?
Yeah, sure. I started out in what's called intellectual history, the history of ideas. But because I was doing the intellectual history of African Americans, I was often relying on a variety of non-traditional intellectual history sources, and also sort of beginning increasingly just to root people's ideas in what they were doing, what their experience was. So that kind of sort of broke apart my intellectual history and introduced the cultural, the social, the legal, everything that people were having to deal with in their daily life.
Yeah, so this makes perfect sense to me, because I think one of the really unusual signatures of your work is this very clever and deliberate braiding of intellectual history, cultural history, social history, and legal history. Mm-hmm. Most historians work on just one of those, but here you are, bringing into conversation the life of the mind, the life of the body, and the legal infrastructure that underwrites a lot of this. So the New York Times, and I love the review of your book in the New York Times, said this about your book: in Mia Bay's superb history of mobility and resistance, the question of literal movement becomes a way to understand the civil rights movement writ large. Can you take us through some of the foundational questions that brought you to study this topic? I mean, where did you what alerted you to it? And I know this book was over a decade in the making. It's a long time. But do you remember the spark?
Yeah, I mean, I think there were a couple of sparks, but one was most certainly writing about Ida B. Wells, this black journalist who fought much of her life against lynching, and she's most known for that. But as I studied her, I realized what really animated her battle was an early experience being thrown out of what was then called a ladies' car in Tennessee in the early 1880s. And it was at a moment when Jim Crow laws had not been passed. Things were sort of unclear, but there was beginning to be discrimination on the railroads, so that these ladies' cars that were supposed to be reserved for women as a sort of more comfortable place, safer place to ride, were increasingly becoming places where black women were not allowed to ride. And that alerted me to just how weird the history of segregation was, that it sort of displaced old distinctions having to do with gender, and whether you smoked or not. The men often traveled in the smoking car, and that it was invented in a complicated way. I began to be curious about, well, then how does it move from one form of transportation to another? Because people had kind of acted like it just sort of takes shape naturally and rolls on into buses, but I actually began to wonder. So it started as a kind of just a curiosity project. I would just sit there and research late at night trying to figure out exactly what was happening. And then I also began to realize that, it was something that black leaders across the political spectrum, and people generally across the class spectrum, had been resented enormously. It had been just a tremendous inconvenience to them. There was activism around it, comments about it. There was so many sources. There was a story that nobody had really ever told.
So from this moment of curiosity, which is, of course, the thing that animates so many projects, you suddenly, if I hear you correctly, sort of found yourself inundated with material, and it must have been something of an avalanche, right?
It was. I was collecting stuff, and I had like another book project that I was planning to finish, but I accumulated so much travel material that I was like, I have to write this book, otherwise I'll end up, like someone with a hoarding disorder in a sea of like papers and books.
I must do this, otherwise I'm going to be drowning. Understood. Okay, so let's get into the kind of the book itself. And this is a long arc, isn't it? I mean, you're really covering centuries rather than just decades.
Right.
Where do you begin?
I begin in the antebellum era, 1820s, 30s, which is basically when what they call legally common carriers, vehicles in which you can buy a ticket and take a ride. That's when you first have things, and they're stagecoaches, steamships, and railways, and that's where I begin. And this age of common carriers also coincides with the first wave of emancipation in the North. So it's an interesting moment of both social and technological change that come together to actually create the first Jim Crow spaces. As people, it's about a new kind of moving space in which people expect to have a sort of cloistered domestic experience, like the interior of a stagecoach. They usually have curtains. They're very kind of contained, and the idea that just anyone could get on one and sit with the middle class people who were the target audience of these rather expensive vehicles is an issue from the beginning.
How interesting. Yeah. So while we will drill down onto the southern particulars of this. It sounds like a national conversation at some level, right?
It is a national conversation, and it always is. I mean, the South develops these very distinctive Jim Crow laws, but various forms of travel segregation and exclusion are always national.
And you saw this early on partly because the North, was industrializing and developing its modes of transportation much more robustly than...
Right.
And so do you see segregation on northern passenger trains, for example, in the antebellum?
Yes, and that's really where it first develops. And like other forms of segregation, it's shaped by not just sort of social divisions, but also the different kinds of space that exist on passenger trains. The very first cars ever called Jim Crow cars were also known as immigrant cars, dirt cars, refuse cars, and they were the car that rode directly behind the engine, which was always kind of a bad railroad car because, the sparks from the coal or whatever they were using to propel the locomotive would often get into that car. It would be very sooty. It sometimes was used to contain various sort of work tools related to the railroad. And it was often a sort of half-price car in which you would put servants, enslaved people, or immigrants who were going to pay half fare. But in the Northeast, especially on the sort of New York to Boston route where there were a lot of black travelers, they would try to put black travelers in that car, whether or not they paid for, full fare or not. And it came to be in that region called the Jim Crow car.
And you make a really interesting observation in your book that, well, let me back up a second and just quote W.E.B. Du Bois on this and spin it from there. This is about the postbellum Jim Crow. He says, there is not in the world a more disgraceful denial of human brotherhood than the Jim Crow car of the southern United States. And plainly, he's pushing back against the humiliation of this, the degradation of it. But you have this interesting point in your book that it is all of that, but there's something physically very dangerous about riding in the Jim Crow car. Could you talk a little bit about that exposure, that very real exposure to the body?
Yeah, I mean, that would change over time, but in addition to being sort of substandard, the Jim Crow car always had certain dangers. Like, one of the reasons they developed the ladies' car in the antebellum era is the sparks used to set ladies' skirts on fire. So they needed to go a little further from the engine.
Yeah, right.
But by the time the era in which Du Bois writes this, Jim Crow cars are typically the oldest car on the train, which becomes incredibly significant as the railroads began to shift from wooden passenger cars to metal passenger cars, because by the time you get to the early 1900s, the beginning of the 20th century, you'll have railroad trains in which the only wooden car on the train is the Jim Crow car. And at that point, when you have a train crash, which were not uncommon during that time period, often the Jim Crow car is the only car that's sort of decimated in the crash. So there was a series of train crashes over the turn of the century, but on until as late as 1950, in which the vast majority of the deaths and injuries occurred. They were people who sat in the Jim Crow car, and they were disproportionately black. They also included some of the train's workmen who were often.
It must have been terrifying just to get on that car with the possibility that if there is an accident, you know what's going to happen.
Yeah, and I did come across, black authors who sort of noted that as one of the terrors of travel.
The terror of travel, yes.
Yes.
That's precisely it. So we have then this deep history that you can find segregation on stagecoaches in the antebellum period, trains in the antebellum period, and then it moves into the postbellum period and basically reiterates itself. And then we kind of approach the automobile age. And I have to say, I found your entire book very interesting. But the automobile stuff, I'm fascinated for very particular reasons that we get to in a moment. Tell us about cars and segregation, because on a certain level, they're individuated, right? I mean, how does segregation work its way into automobiles?
Well, we do think of cars as deeply private, our own sort of palace or home or whatever. But once cars become useful for long distance travel, that requires roads, it requires rest stops, gas stations, hotels, motels. And all of those things are not private, they're not yours. And black travelers will find that these things like hotels, motels, even gas stations do not necessarily cater to them, welcome them. So cars are something that black travelers embrace, but they won't entirely spare them Jim Crow's humiliations. In the South, where you already have Jim Crow laws, you're not gas stations are, for instance, not they're supposed to have bathrooms for whites and bathrooms for blacks, though typically they simply have bathrooms for whites, and blacks are pointed to a field and told to just go out back. So these kind of humiliations, in these spaces immediately reoccur.
So the infrastructure of driving is entirely beyond the car, really, and that's where the problems occur.
That's
right?
where the problems occur.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. So I mean, let's just sort of think about this. This is this is a moment in American history where you have a lot of movement. You have the Great Migration. You have people going beyond their location, really probably for the first time.
Right.
And of course, you know, it makes you think of the whole idea of containing black bodies. I mean, that has been the project since slavery. You couldn't leave the plantation without a pass. And all of a sudden, people are buying cars, even during the Depression, right? I mean, African Americans were fairly keen car purchasers. Is that correct?
They were. I mean, there was a sort of idea that blacks didn't have cars, but in fact, there was a sort of growing sort of vernacular knowledge of cars among blacks, many of whom would eventually come to work as black chauffeurs once it was sort of decided that this was a new good job for black men. And, you know, so they would know how to operate cars, know how to fix cars. And there was like a really robust used car market among African Americans because they were rural people, and rural people needed cars to get around.
Yeah. I mean, an obvious point, but something that we often forget, right? I mean, we're talking about space here, and it's a big country. So here we are then. African Americans have access to cars, but the infrastructure surrounding how to get from A to B is the segregated space or spaces. So how on earth, Mia, do they get from South Carolina to Illinois? You know, what's their mechanism for navigating these long distances where you might not have a restroom for God knows how many miles? You can't get gas, or at least you can't get gas at a conventional gas station. What do they do?
People developed a variety of sort of techniques and knowledge accumulation to travel under Jim Crow. Of course, the most famous are things like the Green Book, and there were many other guides like Travel Guide, the Go Guide, Hackley and Harrison's Guide for Negro travelers. So these are about sort of exchanging information, but there's also a lot of just exchanges among people. People talk about like where you can stop, where you can't stop, where things are dangerous, and they also plan their trips to stop in a minimally. They travel with enormous amounts of food, sort of shoeboxes full of sandwiches, fried chicken. They carry pecans. They carry cans of gasoline in case they can't get gasoline, everything they could possibly need. And sometimes they even travel at night because this sort of tradition of strange black people not being welcome in environments where nobody knows them is something that worries people. And they sort of, you know, load up the car with everything they could possibly need and make their trips in one go if they possibly can. They stay with friends and relatives generally.
So this requires a great deal of planning, sort of foresight, conversation. Just out of curiosity, how long was the Green Book and those other guides to assist African American travelers? How long were they in publication? When was the last Green Book issued, I suppose?
1966.
66?
Yeah.
Remarkable, isn't it?
After the Civil Rights Act of 1964, yeah.
Well, I never. Have you seen it?
Oh, yeah. Oh yeah, there's many of them. Actually, the New York Public Library has virtually all of the Green Books posted on the web, so you can download them and look at them.
And that was the most popular one, right?
That was certainly the most popular and widely circulated one.
Okay, fascinating. 66, I'd never have guessed. I mean, really. Okay, so I want to get down to what it's like to be a black driver in the South, in particular, in this period, which is a long period to be sure. Can you tell us about these ideas about racial rights of way? And by that, just to give some larger context, it's well known that, for example, African Americans walking on a sidewalk are supposed to show deference to white people walking on the sidewalk, right? They step off or they stop. Well, now they have cars. But the rules of the road are supposed to be objective, beyond race, and that's the whole point about rules of the road, isn't it? I mean, it's designed to accelerate the flow of traffic. How did segregation function when black people had cars at stoplights and stop signs? Or did it function? I don't know.
Well, in the early years of driving, let's say the 30s and 40s, there was some idea in deep South states like Mississippi that there should be some sort of racial right of way. So if two people approached a stop sign from different directions, the white person should simply have priority, as was customary on sidewalks in Mississippi during that time period. But of course, that did not work when you had a lot of moving traffic, like at a four-way stop. Right. One black driver interviewed by sociologist Charles Johnson would explain that, he would try to observe racial right-of-way, but then he would have a white driver behind him who would get furious if he was waiting for the other white driver at the other side. So he would just kind of have to go. So this would eventually kind of collapse, but there remained vestiges. Black men were not supposed to drive by white women, pass white women. Black drivers were supposed to be careful about passing white drivers on dusty roads. There was still a little bit of it. So racial right-of-way sort of existed, and there was also this phenomenon that many people talked about of black drivers would often choose automobiles that were not too fancy or lavish to avoid aggravating white people who might think that they are sort of driving above their station.
So much of this has to do with the politics of patience and waiting. Right? I mean, if you sort of think about the long arc of black history in the South especially, but nationally too, it's really about being made to wait. From the days of slavery to driving. You can't pass somebody if they're white. You're waiting for them. And it just strikes me that's kind of one of the pushbacks of the civil rights movement. We are not going to wait any longer. Why we can't wait?
Exactly.
Right? And I just wonder if there is that kind of politics of driving and waiting and the pushback that comes from that, and does it inflect the civil rights consciousness of we don't want to wait in this fashion? Or is it a more legalistic challenge that rises to say, hang on a minute, these forms of segregation just aren't fair?
I think it might be more legalistic. I mean, the thing about the civil rights movement and sort of why we can't wait is that, I mean, American history is so much about yes, this is a country in which all people will be free and equal someday. Like it's so much a dream deferred, as Langston Hughes used to call it. And at a certain point, you realize that you're never going to see this dream if you accept that timeline.
I'm always going to be the person behind the other person in the car.
Yes.
Right. I'm never going to be able to overtake them. I'm never going to be able to pass them. Yeah. See, this is the kind of metaphor that I was working. It's like, this is kind of interesting to me, the lived experience of driving, and then the larger history of civil rights, the perpetual deferment, right? Okay, so we've gone from stagecoaches to these sort of efforts of trains, the antebellum variety, the postbellum, cars, and you then go into airplanes.
Yes, airplanes.
Which I thought was just ingenious. And can you tell us, about the history of segregation on commercial airlines?
Yes, I can. I started out not knowing whether there would be any history. From a sort of legal perspective, since most airlines fly interstate, it ought to have been illegal. But in the beginning, when airlines were airplanes were almost a novelty item, black passengers were simply sometimes not allowed on them. When it was clarified by the court, they were in fact common carriers, which is to say vehicles that are supposed to accept everybody. Various systems of segregated seating evolved, which were easy enough to implement given that there were relatively few blacks who could afford to travel by air for many years. It was a very sort of middle to upper class phenomenon for quite some time. And they would in the beginning they would put black passengers in the first seat of the airplane. There was usually not more than one, which was right by the propeller and really not a desirable seat. And later, as the design changed and the space changed, they would be more likely to relegate black passengers to a sort of isolated aisle somewhere. If there was more than one, they would be put together. And all of this was done by things like using people's, the neighborhood from which they're booking to get a sense of where they came from, or their accent on the telephone. They would, or sometimes stewardesses would simply, if a black passenger appeared, just reseat them. And this came out in bold relief during like, let's say, the Second World War, when if you had black and white soldiers traveling together, they would be separated. This sort of informal segregation.
Incredible. Take us up to the present, because I think one of the enduringly important things about your book is that it connects current practice to the history that you've described. And plainly, there was the intervention of the Civil Rights Act that essentially disbarred this kind of segregation. But it continues, doesn't it? I mean, the segregation on transportation is not something that suddenly ended with the Civil Rights Act. Is that a fair characterization?
Well, it changes. I mean, the kinds of informal segregation and exclusion that were common in the North, become more the prevailing one. But I mean, one of the great tragedies is also that the Civil Rights Act desegregates trains and buses just as we move nationally, become increasingly a car culture. And the number of trains and buses available for long distance travel and even for short distance travel begins to simply plummet. So all of a sudden these spaces are desegregated, but there's many places you cannot travel to by train or bus. So effectively that desegregation doesn't really happen. Yes, I see. Okay. If we look at recent history, can you explain or paint briefly how this segregation still lives on? I mean, there are certain driving while black, for example, black people being disproportionately pulled over for no offense or the same offense or what have you. I'm thinking really here, Mia, of your discussion of natural disasters in particular, and Katrina especially. Yeah, well, that was actually another sort of starting point for this book, which I began researching around the time of Hurricane Katrina. And like everyone else, I was very much struck by how disproportionately black and brown the people left behind in New Orleans were. So one other starting point for this book was sort of researching why people couldn't get out of Katrina, which is a story that simply highlights how transportation inequities around car ownership continue to mean that the experiences of the black traveler today are different than the white traveler. Blacks are disproportionately less likely to own cars as compared to whites, and they face all of these significant racial disadvantages in doing so. Blacks pay more for cars, they pay more for car insurance, they pay more for virtually every aspect of sort of owning and operating a car, and also disproportionately urban, so blacks are less likely to even have a sort of parking space for a car. And because we live in a society that increasingly, there's sort of an assumption that people will own cars, places like New Orleans had no real plan for evacuating people who didn't own cars. They had a very good plan for car evacuation. That rerouted the highways so everyone could sort of drive out of the city. They had on their website and in their office at the time of Hurricane Katrina nothing for people who didn't own cars other than the advice that they find a friend who had a car and get a ride with them, which obviously was not necessarily viable for people who lived in the heart of New Orleans and didn't have friends who had cars.
You know, when I read that, I was reminded of the evacuation plans for Hurricane Camille in 1969 in southern Mississippi. And there were buses put on by the state to evacuate the regions that were going to be hit most hard. But those buses, those evacuation buses, were in fact segregated too.
Oh my goodness.
Which is a remarkable state. If you think about it, you've got a Category 5 hurricane barreling down on you. And what's on their mind? Well, we must segregate these evacuation buses. Chilling stuff. Can you say something, and you know, this is the kind of his history geek in me coming out, but I'm really interested in the research that you undertook for this, because it's so sprawling and wide-ranging, and it requires a kind of forensic attention to detail, but across all sorts of sources. I mean, you're dealing with, at one level, you're dealing with advertising. Right? You're dealing with the mechanics of transportation. You're dealing with individuals, Jack Johnson's experience. I mean, this is all over the place. How do you begin to get your arms around this?
Well, I often started in black newspapers, which contained reports on legal cases, contained discourse about white chauffeurs attacking black chauffeurs. You know, like if I searched for, I took advantage of everything you can do on the internet around sort of all sorts of complicated searches where you look for words together and stuff. Yeah. So I was looking for stuff about. The book is organized by different kinds of transportation, so I did a lot of searches around things like Negroes in cars, Negroes in automobiles, Negroes in jalopies, like using old-fashioned words for cars. And kind of once I got a sense of what the issues were, I could delve further into things like, you know, advertising publications, and look for secondary sources that might help illuminate what I was sort of the beginnings of a story that I was seeing. And legal cases also sometimes give you a sense of what the beginnings of a story are.
Yeah. I mean, every historian who writes a book always has their notes afterwards, right? And it fills a couple of, 2 or 3 filing cabinets or what have you. I should imagine your notes must be like rooms of having so much of it.
Yeah, there's so much stuff.
What's next? What is Mia working on now?
Well, I'm circling back to the book I sort of put on the back burner as this one began to outgrow my apartment and my filing space. And that is a somewhat more contained, though not very contained, book on African American ideas about Thomas Jefferson, who is someone that I was surprised many years ago in researching my first book. Thomas Jefferson is discussed in antebellum era African American newspapers more than you would think going in, and he's discussed as sort of a figure that almost embodies the contradictions of American democracy. He on the one hand, he has some of the most eloquent statements of anti-slavery sentiment and sort of a sense that this is a bad institution of any founding father, but at the same time, he is a slaveholder and deeply invested in the institution himself. And he's someone that many prominent African American thinkers kind of turn to wrestle with some of these issues. So,
how far are you along? Are you in the research stage or writing?
No, I'm sort of re-researching at this point, but I've written, a couple of chapters, and I'm sort of trying to decide how far to take it into the, towards the present. I mean, I think I would argue he's sort of most central in Black thought prior to the Civil War, at which point Lincoln becomes the president everyone loves to hate, love and hate. But he does come up in like the writings of the Black Panthers. Obama was a big Jefferson guy.
Interesting.
So I might kind of take it all the way.
Oh, please do. I think that's really exciting. I think that long arc, because This is one of your skills, right? I mean, not many people can write long arc history and keep the narrative together, and you certainly can. The book is Traveling Black. The author is Mia Bay. Mia Bay, thank you for being on Take on the South.
Thank you.
That was our Take on the South. Let us know yours. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at U of SC South. Take on the South is produced by Matt Simmons of the Institute for Southern Studies. Special thanks to Professor Dave Garner of the University of South Carolina School of Music for composing our music. Tune in next time for another Take on the South.